The Pacific Ocean was calm on the morning of July 24, 1943. Far from any coastline, in waters heavily traveled by Japanese shipping, an American submarine waited just below the surface. Her name was USS Tinosa. She was one of dozens of submarines sent into the Pacific with a simple but deadly mission: sink Japan's merchant fleet and choke the Empire's supply lines. The submarine's commander that day was John W. Scott. Like many American submarine captains early in the war, Scott had spent weeks patrolling vast, empty ocean. Submarine warfare was a patient hunter's game. Sometimes a crew could spend an entire patrol without seeing a single target. But on this day, luck finally arrived. Through the periscope, the lookout spotted a large silhouette on the horizon. As the submarine closed the distance, the shape became clear. It was a massive Japanese oil tanker, later identified as the Tonan Maru No. 3. Oil tankers were among the most valuable targets in the entire Pacific War. Japan had almost no domestic oil supply. Every gallon had to travel thousands of miles across the ocean to reach the Empire's factories, ships, and aircraft. What made the situation even more remarkable was that the tanker was already crippled. Earlier that day, another American submarine had attacked and damaged it. The giant ship was now limping through the water, struggling to escape. Even more astonishing, there were no escorting warships nearby. For a submarine commander, this was the perfect scenario. A large, slow target, no destroyers, no aircraft overhead, no sonar searching the sea, just a wounded tanker trying to crawl home. Scott maneuvered his submarine into position. Inside the control room of USS Tinosa, the crew moved with quiet precision. Torpedoes were loaded into the tubes. Angles were calculated, speed and distance were measured again and again. Finally, the submarine reached an almost ideal firing position: 875 yards. In submarine warfare, that distance was practically point blank. The weapon they were about to fire was the standard American submarine torpedo of the war, the Mark 14 torpedo. Nearly 21 feet long and weighing over 3,000 pounds, it carried a massive explosive warhead designed to tear open the hull of any ship afloat. Scott watched the tanker through the periscope and waited for the exact moment. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered slightly as the first torpedo left the tube and raced through the dark water toward the target. The crew counted silently. Then they heard it, a metallic clang. Not the violent underwater explosion they expected, just a dull, hollow impact against the steel hull of the tanker. Scott frowned but assumed something unusual had happened. Perhaps the angle had been wrong. Fire 2. Another torpedo streaked toward the ship. Another clang. Still no explosion. The crew stared at each other in confusion. Fire 3. Again the same sound, a hard metallic impact echoing through the ocean like a hammer striking a ship's hull, but still no explosion. By now the crew understood something was terribly wrong. Scott kept firing. 4, 5, 6. Each torpedo struck the target. Each one produced the same strange sound: clang, clang, clang. 9 torpedoes in total slammed into the tanker's hull. 9 direct hits, 9 failures. Inside the control room, disbelief spread through the crew. Torpedoes were supposed to detonate on contact. That was the basic principle of naval warfare. Yet here they were watching a perfect target absorb hit after hit without suffering serious damage. Through the periscope, Scott could see the tanker still moving forward, scarred and dented perhaps, but very much alive. The American submarine had delivered what should have been a fatal blow. Instead, nothing happened. Scott had 1 torpedo left. He faced a difficult decision: fire the final weapon and risk losing the physical evidence of what had just happened, or keep it. He made a choice that would echo far beyond this patrol. He did not fire. Instead, he turned the submarine away from the tanker and began the long journey back to base at Pearl Harbor. The mission was no longer about sinking ships. It was about proving that something was very wrong. When USS Tenosa arrived back in Pearl Harbor, Scott carried his remaining torpedo with him as evidence. He insisted that the weapon be tested immediately under controlled conditions. The test results shocked everyone who witnessed them. The torpedo struck the target perfectly, and again, it did not explode. For the men who had been risking their lives in submarines across the Pacific, this moment confirmed their worst suspicions. The failure at Tenosa was not an isolated accident. Submarine crews had been reporting similar problems since the earliest months of the war. Torpedoes that ran too deep, torpedoes that detonated too early, and most frustratingly, torpedoes that struck enemy ships and simply failed to explode. But for nearly 2 years, those reports had been dismissed. Some officials blamed the crews, others claimed the commanders were firing from bad angles or miscalculating distances. A few even suggested that the submarine captains were exaggerating their attack results. Yet the evidence kept piling up. Across the Pacific, American submariners were risking their lives, closing in on enemy ships, lining up perfect attacks, and watching their weapons fail at the moment they mattered most. The incident with USS Tenosa made one thing impossible to ignore. 9 torpedoes hit a helpless target. 9 times the weapon had failed. The question now was unavoidable. How had the United States Navy entered the largest naval war in history, armed with torpedoes that didn't work? And even more disturbing, who knew about the problem before the war even began?
In the early years of the Pacific War, American submariners began to notice a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Patrol after patrol returned with the same frustrating story: perfect firing solutions, clear hits on enemy ships, and yet, somehow, the targets survived. The crews of these submarines were among the most highly trained sailors in the United States Navy. They knew how to calculate speed, distance, and angle with extreme precision. In many cases, they were firing from ideal positions: short range, perfect angles, calm seas. Yet the results were baffling. Torpedoes ran beneath ships without detonating, others exploded too early, and sometimes, like the attack carried out by USS Tenosa, they struck the hull of a target and simply failed to explode at all. To understand why this was happening, we have to look at the weapon itself. The standard torpedo used by American submarines during the early years of World War II was the Mark 14 torpedo. It was supposed to be one of the most advanced naval weapons ever designed. Over 20 feet long and powered by a sophisticated steam engine, it could travel more than 4,000 yards at high speed and carried a warhead powerful enough to rip apart even the largest ships. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. But the real story of this weapon began long before the war. The development and testing of the Mark 14 had been handled by a powerful organization inside the Navy called the Bureau of Ordnance. Known simply as BUORD, this bureau was responsible for designing, testing, and approving the Navy's weapons systems. For years, the Bureau of Ordnance assured Navy leadership that the Mark 14 torpedo was fully reliable. According to official reports, it had passed every required test. But those tests had a serious problem. They were extremely limited. In fact, the Mark 14 torpedo had been live-fire tested only twice during its entire development process. The last full test had taken place roughly 15 years before the United States entered World War II. Even more troubling, many of those tests did not use live warheads. Instead of firing torpedoes that would explode on impact, engineers often used practice heads filled with water. These tests focused mainly on whether the torpedo could travel through the water and reach a target. What they did not test thoroughly was the most important part of the weapon, the detonator. At the heart of the Mark 14's explosive system was a device called the Mark 6 magnetic exploder. This mechanism was designed to detect the magnetic field of a large steel ship as the torpedo passed underneath it. Instead of striking the hull directly, the torpedo would explode beneath the vessel's keel. Underwater explosion would break the vessel's back, often sinking it instantly. In theory, it was far more destructive than a simple contact explosion. It was also extremely complicated. The magnetic exploder relied on delicate sensors that measured subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Those sensors had been tested in controlled conditions near the United States, but the Pacific Ocean presented very different magnetic environments, and those differences turned out to be critical. By late 1941, some engineers within the Navy had already begun to suspect that the system might not work properly in combat conditions. In internal evaluations, there were indications that the magnetic exploder could trigger prematurely or fail to activate entirely. In October of 1941, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, warnings about the detonator system were quietly circulated among technical staff. But those concerns never resulted in a major redesign. Part of the reason was institutional confidence. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent years developing the Mark 14. Admitting that the weapon might be flawed would mean admitting that the entire program had failed. There was also another problem. Live fire testing with real warheads was expensive. Every torpedo cost thousands of dollars, and in the years before the war, the Navy had strict budget limitations. Destroying a torpedo during testing meant losing a valuable weapon. So instead of firing torpedoes at real ships with live warheads, many tests used reduced conditions or simulated results. On paper, everything looked perfect. In reality, the torpedo had never been fully tested in the way it would actually be used in combat. Once the United States entered the war, the consequences were clear. Submarine captains began filing reports describing identical failures. Torpedoes ran deeper than the depth settings indicated. Magnetic exploders detonated too early. And sometimes, like the attack carried out by USS Tinosa, they struck the hull of a target and simply failed to explode at all. To understand why this was happening, we have to look at the weapon itself. The standard torpedo used by American submarines during the early years of World War II was the Mark 14 torpedo. It was supposed to be one of the most advanced naval weapons ever designed. Over 20 feet long and powered by a sophisticated steam engine, it could travel more than 4,000 yards at high speed and carried a warhead powerful enough to rip apart even the largest ships. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. But the real story of this weapon began long before the war. The development and testing of the Mark 14 had been handled by a powerful organization inside the Navy called the Bureau of Ordnance. Known simply as BUORD, this bureau was responsible for designing, testing, and approving the Navy's weapons systems. For years, the Bureau of Ordnance assured Navy leadership that the Mark 14 torpedo was fully reliable. According to official reports, it had passed every required test. But those tests had a serious problem. They were extremely limited. In fact, the Mark 14 torpedo had been live fire tested only twice during its entire development process. The last full test had taken place roughly 15 years before the United States entered World War II. Even more troubling, many of those tests did not use live warheads. Instead of firing torpedoes that would explode on impact, engineers often used practice heads filled with water. These tests focused mainly on whether the torpedo could travel through the water and reach a target. What they did not test thoroughly was the most important part of the weapon, the detonator. At the heart of the Mark 14's explosive system was a device called the Mark 6 magnetic exploder. This mechanism was designed to detect the magnetic field of a large steel ship as the torpedo passed underneath it. Instead of striking the hull directly, the torpedo would explode beneath the vessel's keel. Underwater explosion would break the vessel's back, often sinking it instantly. In theory, it was far more destructive than a simple contact explosion. It was also extremely complicated. The magnetic exploder relied on delicate sensors that measured subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Those sensors had been tested in controlled conditions near the United States, but the Pacific Ocean presented very different magnetic environments, and those differences turned out to be critical. By late 1941, some engineers within the Navy had already begun to suspect that the system might not work properly in combat conditions. In internal evaluations, there were indications that the magnetic exploder could trigger prematurely or fail to activate entirely. In October of 1941, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, warnings about the detonator system were quietly circulated among technical staff. But those concerns never resulted in a major redesign. Part of the reason was institutional confidence. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent years developing the Mark 14. Admitting that the weapon might be flawed would mean admitting that the entire program had failed. There was also another problem. Live fire testing with real warheads was expensive. Every torpedo cost thousands of dollars, and in the years before the war, the Navy had strict budget limitations. Destroying a torpedo during testing meant losing a valuable weapon. So instead of firing torpedoes at real ships with live warheads, many tests used reduced conditions or simulated results. On paper, everything looked perfect. In reality, the torpedo had never been fully tested in the way it would actually be used in combat. Once the United States entered the war, the consequences were clear. Submarine captains began filing reports describing identical failures. Torpedoes ran deeper than the depth settings indicated. Magnetic exploders detonated too early. And sometimes, like the attack carried out by USS Tinosa, they struck the hull of a target and simply failed to explode at all. To understand why this was happening, we have to look at the weapon itself. The standard torpedo used by American submarines during the early years of World War II was the Mark 14 torpedo. It was supposed to be one of the most advanced naval weapons ever designed. Over 20 feet long and powered by a sophisticated steam engine, it could travel more than 4,000 yards at high speed and carried a warhead powerful enough to rip apart even the largest ships. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. But the real story of this weapon began long before the war. The development and testing of the Mark 14 had been handled by a powerful organization inside the Navy. By early 1943, frustration inside the American submarine force had reached a breaking point. Patrol after patrol returned with reports that made no sense. Enemy ships were being hit. The sounds of impact were heard through the hull, and yet instead of explosions, there was only silence. Submarine captains were beginning to suspect that the problem was not their tactics, it was their weapons. One of the men who refused to ignore these reports was Charles A. Lockwood. Lockwood had spent most of his career in submarines. Unlike many senior officers in Washington, he understood exactly what it meant to command a submarine in combat. He knew the pressures, he knew the risks, and most importantly, he trusted the judgment of his captains. When Lockwood began reviewing patrol reports from across the Pacific, a pattern quickly emerged. The same failures were appearing again and again. Torpedoes were running beneath ships without detonating. Others exploded prematurely, giving away a submarine's position. And in the most frustrating cases, torpedoes were striking the hull of a ship and simply failing to explode. These weren't isolated incidents, they were happening everywhere.
But when Lockwood raised these concerns with the powerful Bureau of Ordnance, the response was immediate and firm. The torpedo, they insisted, was not the problem. According to the Bureau, the Mark 14 had passed all official tests. If torpedoes were failing in combat, then the explanation must lie somewhere else. Perhaps submarine crews were miscalculating target speeds. Perhaps they were firing from poor angles. Perhaps battle stress was affecting their performance. For the men who had spent months risking their lives in enemy waters, these explanations felt like an insult. Lockwood was not convinced. Instead of accepting the official explanation, he began conducting his own investigation, quietly at first, and sometimes without authorization. The first issue he wanted to examine was depth. Submarine torpedoes were designed to run at a specific depth below the water's surface. The captain would set this depth depending on the size of the target ship. Ideally, the torpedo would travel just beneath the ship's hull before detonating. But submarine crews had begun to suspect that their torpedoes were running deeper than they were supposed to. To test this theory, Lockwood ordered a series of experiments near the submarine base in Hawaii. Nets were suspended underwater and torpedoes were fired through them so their actual depth could be measured. The results were shocking. The torpedoes were running much deeper than the depth settings indicated. In some cases, they were traveling 10 to 15 feet deeper than intended. This meant that when a submarine aimed at the hull of a ship, the torpedo often passed safely underneath it without ever touching the target. Lockwood ordered the depth mechanisms recalibrated immediately. But fixing the depth problem did not solve everything. Submarine crews continued reporting mysterious detonations and failures. Torpedoes were still exploding too early or not exploding at all. The next suspect was the complex magnetic detonator system, the Mark 6 magnetic exploder. In theory, the magnetic exploder was supposed to be a revolutionary innovation. Instead of hitting the side of a ship, the torpedo would detect the ship's magnetic field as it passed underneath and detonate beneath the keel. The resulting explosion would break the ship's backbone. But in the real conditions of the Pacific Ocean, the system behaved unpredictably. Sometimes it triggered too early, causing the torpedo to explode harmlessly before reaching the target. In other cases, it failed to activate entirely. Lockwood made a bold decision. He ordered submarine crews to disable the magnetic exploder and rely only on the contact detonator, the simpler mechanism that triggered when a torpedo physically struck a ship. It was a controversial move. The magnetic system had been heavily promoted by the Bureau of Ordnance as a major technological breakthrough, but Lockwood believed the evidence was clear. Yet even after disabling the magnetic system, problems continued. Submarine captains were still reporting something strange. Torpedoes that struck enemy ships at certain angles were failing to detonate, particularly one angle, 90 degrees, a perfect perpendicular hit. Ironically, the ideal firing solution for a submarine attack, approaching a target from the side, was producing the worst possible result. Instead of detonating, the torpedo simply bounced off the hull. To investigate this mystery, engineers finally conducted tests using real warheads and steel plates that simulated a ship's hull. The results revealed the final flaw. Inside the torpedo's contact detonator was a small firing pin mechanism designed to strike a primer when the torpedo hit its target, but the design had a critical weakness. At high speed, a direct 90-degree impact caused the firing pin to jam instead of striking the primer. The force of the collision actually bent internal parts of the detonator mechanism. In other words, the more perfect the shot, the more likely the torpedo was to fail. For nearly 2 years, American submariners had been firing their most powerful weapon under exactly the conditions that made it least likely to work. Once Lockwood understood the problem, he pushed for immediate modifications. The firing pin was redesigned and strengthened so it would not jam during a direct impact. Slowly, the fixes began to take effect.
Depth settings were corrected, the unreliable magnetic detonator was disabled, the contact detonator was reinforced, and as these changes spread through the submarine fleet, something remarkable began to happen. The same captains who had once returned from patrol frustrated and empty-handed were now reporting something very different. Enemy ships were exploding, convoys were being shattered, Japanese tankers and cargo vessels were beginning to disappear beneath the waves. For the first time since the war began, American submarines were finally fighting with weapons that worked. But the question that lingered over the entire submarine force was impossible to ignore. How many opportunities had been lost? How many enemy ships had escaped? And how many American submariners had risked or even lost their lives during those first terrible years, all because the Navy refused to admit that its torpedo was broken?
By the middle of 1943, something began to change in the Pacific. For nearly 2 years, American submariners had fought a frustrating war beneath the waves. They had stalked enemy convoys, risked detection by destroyers, and fired torpedoes that often failed at the exact moment they were needed most. But after months of investigation and quiet modifications, the submarine force finally began to receive torpedoes that actually worked. The fixes were not dramatic inventions or revolutionary new weapons. They were corrections to mistakes that had been hidden inside the system since before the war. The torpedoes were adjusted so they ran at the proper depth. The unreliable magnetic detonator was disabled, and the fragile contact detonator was strengthened so it would explode even during a direct 90-degree impact. The weapon at the center of this transformation was still the same torpedo that submariners had been using since the beginning of the war, the Mark 14 torpedo. But now it finally functioned the way it had always been supposed to. Almost immediately, the results across the Pacific began to change. Submarine patrol reports that once described frustration and failure were suddenly filled with confirmed sinkings. Ships that previously would have survived multiple torpedo hits were now exploding violently and disappearing beneath the ocean within minutes. For the crews of American submarines, the difference was dramatic. The submarine force had always been a relatively small branch of the Navy. At the beginning of the war, submarines represented only a tiny fraction of American naval power. Battleships, aircraft carriers, and cruisers received most of the attention and resources. Yet these small underwater vessels had one enormous advantage. They could go anywhere. While surface fleets were tied to major battles and carrier operations, submarines could slip deep into enemy shipping lanes. They could hide along trade routes, wait silently for convoys, and attack targets that were critical to the enemy's survival. Once their torpedoes began working properly, those advantages became devastating. American submarines began hunting the merchant ships that kept the Japanese Empire alive. Tankers carrying precious oil, cargo ships loaded with raw materials, transports filled with soldiers and equipment. One by one, those ships began to vanish. At the same time, Japan's own submarine force was operating across the Pacific. On paper, Japanese submarines were among the most advanced in the world. Many of them were larger, faster, and capable of traveling farther than their American counterparts. Their torpedoes were also extremely powerful. One of their most effective weapons was the Type 95 torpedo, a fast and deadly weapon derived from the famous oxygen-powered torpedoes used by Japanese surface ships. Technically speaking, Japan's submarines had impressive capabilities, but their strategy was very different. Instead of attacking merchant shipping, Japanese submarine commanders were usually ordered to hunt warships. They focused on aircraft carriers, cruisers, and other naval targets. This strategy reflected traditional naval thinking. Destroying enemy warships was seen as the key to winning control of the ocean. But in the vast geography of the Pacific, warships were relatively rare targets. Convoys carrying fuel and resources, on the other hand, moved constantly between Japan and its occupied territories. American submarine commanders understood something that Japanese planners largely ignored. Wars were not won only by destroying enemy warships. They were won by destroying the systems that kept an enemy nation functioning. As 1943 turned into 1944, American submarines began spreading across Japan's major shipping routes. They hunted the long supply lines that stretched from Southeast Asia to the Japanese home islands. Oil was the most important target of all. Japan depended heavily on oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Tankers carried this fuel thousands of miles back to Japan's factories, power plants, and military bases. Without those shipments, the empire's war machine could not function. American submarines began waiting along these routes like silent predators. Every successful torpedo attack meant one less tanker reaching Japan. Every sinking meant fewer supplies for Japanese industry. And unlike large naval battles, submarine warfare was relentless. It did not happen in a single dramatic clash. It happened slowly, day after day, patrol after patrol. One convoy destroyed here, another tanker sunk there. Month by month, the numbers began to add up. Japanese shipping losses started to climb sharply. Cargo vessels carrying rubber, iron ore, and food were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Tankers were becoming especially vulnerable targets. The empire had entered the war believing its navy could protect these lifelines. But the ocean was vast, and submarines were almost impossible to stop. Even when Japan began organizing convoys protected by destroyers and aircraft, the effort came too late. By the time large escort systems were implemented, American submarines were already deeply embedded along the shipping routes, and now they had torpedoes that worked. For the men serving aboard American submarines, the war beneath the waves had finally become what it was always meant to be: a silent campaign of economic destruction. They were no longer simply attacking ships. They were slowly tightening a grip around the entire Japanese empire. And with every torpedo that exploded correctly beneath the hull of a tanker or cargo ship, that grip grew stronger. By 1944, the effects of the submarine campaign were becoming impossible for Japan to ignore. What had begun as scattered attacks by small underwater vessels had evolved into something far more dangerous. American submarines were no longer simply sinking individual ships. They were systematically dismantling the entire maritime lifeline that connected Japan to its empire. Japan was an island nation with very limited natural resources. Before the war, its economy depended heavily on imports from across Asia and the Pacific. Oil came from Southeast Asia. Iron ore, rubber, food, and other critical materials traveled thousands of miles by sea to reach Japanese factories and cities. Without shipping, none of those resources could reach the home islands. And American submarines were hunting that shipping with increasing success. At the beginning of the war, Japan possessed one of the largest merchant fleets in the world. Thousands of cargo ships and tankers moved constantly between occupied territories and the Japanese mainland. These ships carried the fuel that powered aircraft, the steel used to build ships and weapons, and the food needed to feed millions of civilians and soldiers. But merchant ships were also slow, lightly armed, and extremely vulnerable. Submarines began attacking them everywhere. Some attacks took place in the narrow seas near Japan itself. Others occurred along distant routes stretching across the South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and the waters surrounding Southeast Asia. No matter where the convoys traveled, submarines seemed to appear. At first, Japanese naval planners did not fully understand the scale of the threat. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been trained to fight decisive fleet battles. Protecting cargo convoys was not considered a prestigious mission, and early in the war there were relatively few escort ships assigned to merchant shipping. This left enormous gaps in Japan's defensive system. American submarines exploited those gaps with ruthless efficiency. By late 1944, shipping losses had reached alarming levels. Tankers carrying oil from Southeast Asia were disappearing at a rate that Japanese industry could not replace. Cargo vessels filled with raw materials were vanishing across the Pacific. Every sinking meant fewer supplies reaching the factories that produced aircraft, tanks, and weapons. Fuel shortages soon began spreading throughout Japan's military. Pilots could not train properly because aviation gasoline was scarce. Warships often remained in port because there was not enough fuel for large-scale operations. Even the Japanese army fighting across Asia began experiencing shortages of equipment and supplies. Meanwhile, American submarines continued their relentless patrols. One by one, the Empire's shipping routes were collapsing. After the war, analysts attempted to measure exactly how devastating this campaign had been. One of the most important studies was conducted by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, which examined the causes of Japan's economic collapse. Their findings were striking. Although submarines made up only a small portion of the United States Navy, they were responsible for sinking more than half of Japan's total merchant fleet during the war. Thousands of ships were destroyed. Millions of tons of cargo never reached its destination. In effect, the ocean highways that connected Japan to its empire had been severed. Without those shipping routes, the Japanese economy slowly began to suffocate. Factories ran out of raw materials, power plants lacked fuel, military bases struggled to maintain supplies. Food shortages became increasingly severe as imports declined. By 1945, the situation had become catastrophic. Oil shipments had dropped to a tiny fraction of their pre-war levels. Many Japanese ships could no longer leave port because there simply was not enough fuel to operate them. Aviation training programs were cut drastically because aviation gasoline had become so scarce. Entire sections of the Japanese war machine were grinding to a halt, not because they had been destroyed in battle, but because they could no longer be supplied. Ironically, Japan possessed submarines that were technically impressive. Many were large, fast, and capable of traveling extraordinary distances across the Pacific. Their torpedoes, such as the Type 95 torpedo, were powerful and reliable weapons. But the strategic focus of the Japanese submarine force had been very different. Rather than targeting merchant shipping, Japanese submarines were usually assigned to hunt American warships. They spent enormous effort searching for aircraft carriers and major naval units. While those targets were certainly valuable, they were also rare and heavily defended. Meanwhile, the vast network of cargo ships that sustained Japan's economy continued operating with limited protection during the early years of the war. American submarine commanders took the opposite approach. They focused on the enemy's supply system. Instead of hunting warships, they hunted the ships that kept those warships fueled, armed, and operational. This difference in strategy had enormous consequences. By the final year of the war, Japan was facing not just military defeat, but economic collapse. Its industries were starved of materials, its navy lacked fuel, its ability to transport resources across the ocean had been shattered. The silent campaign beneath the waves had achieved something extraordinary. A relatively small force of submarines had slowly strangled the economy of an entire empire. And yet, the story carries a final, uncomfortable truth. For nearly 2 years at the beginning of the war, the men of the American submarine force had been fighting with weapons that did not work. Torpedoes that ran too deep, detonators that failed on perfect impact, a system so flawed that some of the best attack opportunities of the war had slipped away.
Once those problems were finally fixed, the results were devastating. But the question that remains is impossible to answer completely. If the torpedoes had worked from the very beginning, how much sooner might the collapse of Japan's shipping network have come?